The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail, its relentless heat shimmering off the red earth like waves of liquid fire. Charles Goodnight pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face, squinting against the glare as his horse's hooves rhythmically struck the hardpan. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of brown and amber, broken only by the occasional mesquite tree clinging desperately to life in this unforgiving wilderness. He had been riding for 3 days straight, pushing toward Fort Worth with a herd of cattle that represented everything he had worked for since returning from the war. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like the oppressive heat. But Charles had learned long ago that a man's word was all he had out here, and he had given his word to deliver those cattle on time. As he crested a small rise, something caught his eye in the distance, a dark shape against the pale earth, too geometric to be natural. Charles reined in his horse, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. In this country, anything out of place could mean trouble, and trouble usually came with bullets. He had seen too much death during the war, too much senseless violence to take any chances now. But as he urged his mount forward, the shape resolved into something that made his chest tighten with a different kind of dread. A covered wagon sat listing to one side, its canvas torn and flapping in the hot wind like a wounded bird. One wheel was completely gone, and the contents of the wagon were scattered across the ground like the remnants of a shattered dream. Charles had seen this scene before too many times. Raiders, probably Comancheros, or maybe just desperate men turned to banditry, had struck another family trying to make their way west. He should keep riding, he told himself. He had his own responsibilities, his own troubles. Getting involved in someone else's tragedy would only complicate things, and complications out here could be deadly. But then he saw her. A woman lay crumpled beside the wagon, her dark dress torn and dusty, her long brown hair spread across the red earth like spilled coffee. She wasn't moving. Charles felt his heart skip a beat, and before he could think better of it, he was spurring his horse forward, dismounting before the animal had even come to a complete stop. He knelt beside the woman, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for signs of life. She was breathing, thank God, but barely. Her face was pale beneath the dust and grime, and there was a large bruise on her temple where something had struck her hard. "Ma'am," he called softly, his voice rough from days of silence. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" There was no response, just the whisper of wind through the broken wagon and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Charles looked around, taking in the full scope of the devastation. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. A child's doll, torn photographs, a family Bible with pages fluttering in the breeze. And there, partially hidden behind the wagon, he could make out what remained of 2 bodies. A man and a young boy, both still and silent in the terrible finality of death. Charles felt something twist in his stomach, a familiar knot of anger and helplessness that he remembered from the war. How many innocent people had he seen cut down by violence? How many families destroyed by men who took what they wanted and left nothing but grief in their wake? He had tried to leave that world behind, to find some measure of peace in the simple honesty of working cattle and riding the open range. But here it was again, death and destruction following him like his own shadow. The woman stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips. Charles made his decision in that moment, though he couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the way she looked so small and vulnerable against the vast emptiness of the plains. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who had died while he was away fighting for causes he no longer believed in. Or maybe it was simply that a man couldn't call himself a man if he rode away from someone who needed help, regardless of the consequences. "You're going to be all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "I'm going to get you out of here." He gathered water from his canteen and gently wet her lips, watching as some color returned to her face. Whatever had happened here, whoever had done this, they would pay. But first he had to save the one person who had survived. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Charles Goodnight made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes salvation comes not from what we find, but from what finds us. And in that moment, under the vast Texas sky, two broken souls found each other in the dust and the gathering dusk. The first thing Sarah Mitchell remembered was the taste of dust in her mouth, bitter and gritty like the remnants of a nightmare she couldn't quite escape. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, the harsh afternoon light sending sharp pains through her skull. A shadow moved above her, and panic seized her chest like a vice. She tried to scream, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from her parched throat. Strong hands pressed gently against her shoulders, and a voice she didn't recognize spoke in low, soothing tones. "Easy now, ma'am. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you." The voice belonged to a man with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the unforgiving sun. He wore the clothes of a cowboy, but there was something different about him, something that made her want to trust him, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. "My name is Charles Goodnight. I found you by your wagon. You've been unconscious for hours." Memory crashed back into Sarah's mind like a stampede of wild horses. The sound of gunfire echoing across the prairie, her husband James shouting for her to run, little Timothy crying for his mother as rough hands dragged him away from her protective embrace, the sickening thud of a rifle butt against her skull as she fought to reach her son, and then nothing but darkness and the terrible silence that followed violence. "James," she whispered, her voice breaking, "my husband, my son, where are they?" But even as she asked, she could see the answer in Charles's eyes. The same look she had seen in the mirror after her father died. The same expression that followed terrible news, like vultures following carrion. She didn't want to know, but she had to know. "Please," she said, struggling to sit up despite the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. "I need to see them." Charles helped her to her feet, his arms steady around her waist as she swayed unsteadily. He led her slowly around the destroyed wagon, his presence both comforting and heartbreaking, because it meant she was truly alone now. The bodies lay where they had fallen, covered respectfully with a blanket Charles had taken from his own bedroll. Sarah fell to her knees beside them, her hands shaking as she pulled back the covering. James looked peaceful, almost as if he were sleeping. But Timothy, her beautiful boy, who had been so excited about their new life in California, would never wake up again. The grief hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over as sobs tore from her throat. She had lost everything in a matter of minutes. Her husband, her child, her future, all scattered like dust in the wind. Charles knelt beside her, saying nothing, simply offering the quiet strength of his presence. He had learned during the war that sometimes there were no words for certain kinds of pain, no comfort that could ease the weight of loss. All a person could do was bear witness to another's suffering and hope that somehow sharing the burden made it easier to carry. "They came out of nowhere," Sarah finally managed to say between ragged breaths. 6 or 7 men, led by someone with a scar across his face. "They wanted our money, our supplies, everything we had worked for. James tried to fight them, tried to protect us, but..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Charles felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same cold fury that had sustained him through battles and betrayals. He had seen Tom Bradley's handiwork before, recognized the particular brand of cruelty that the scarred outlaw left in his wake. "Mom, I'm sorry for your loss," Charles said quietly, "but we can't stay here. Those men might come back, and if they do, they won't leave any witnesses." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. She couldn't be more than 24, but grief had aged her beyond her years. "I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered. "Everything I had, everything I was, is gone." Charles made another decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him. He had always been a solitary man, someone who preferred the company of his horse and the vast emptiness of the range to the complications of human relationships. But something about this woman, This broken soul who had lost everything, called to something deep within him. Maybe it was recognition, the understanding that comes from one damaged person meeting another. Maybe it was simply the right thing to do. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand to help her up. "I'm headed to Fort Worth, but I can take you anywhere you need to go. You don't have to face this alone." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, weighing her options. She could stay here and die beside her family, or she could take the hand of a stranger and step into an uncertain future. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah Mitchell placed her hand in Charles Goodnight's and chose to live. They buried James and Timothy Mitchell as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of mourning. Charles had fashioned rough crosses from broken wagon wood, while Sarah gathered wildflowers from the sparse prairie grass. The service was simple, just Sarah's whispered prayers and the sound of wind through the mesquite. Charles stood silently beside her, his hat in his hands, thinking about all the good men he had buried during the war and wondering why the innocent always seemed to pay the highest price. By dawn, they were riding north toward Fort Worth, Sarah seated behind Charles on his sturdy bay gelding. She had salvaged what little she could from the wreckage: a locket with Timothy's baby hair, her mother's wedding ring, and the family Bible that had somehow survived the destruction. Everything else that had represented her old life lay scattered across the prairie, claimed by the wind and the endless sky. The rhythm of the horse's gait was soothing, and for the first time since the attack, Sarah felt something other than raw grief. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was a respite from the crushing weight of loss. "Tell me about them," Charles said quietly as they rode. He had learned that sometimes talking about the dead helped the living process their grief. Sarah was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer, but then she began to speak, her voice barely audible above the steady clip-clop of hooves on hardpan. "James was a teacher back in Missouri," she said, and Charles could hear the smile in her voice despite her tears. "He read to Timothy every night before bed. Shakespeare mostly, because he said great literature should be shared with children early. Timothy was only 6, but he could already recite parts of Hamlet." She paused, her hands tightening around Charles's waist as a particularly vivid memory surfaced. He wanted to be a cowboy when he grew up, said he was going to ride the biggest horse in Texas and catch the meanest bulls. Charles felt something twist in his chest at the mention of the boy's dream. How many children had he seen during the war whose dreams would never come true? How many futures had been cut short by violence and hatred? He pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the woman behind him who was trying so hard to hold herself together. The second day brought new challenges. Charles noticed dust clouds on the horizon behind them, too regular to be natural, too persistent to be coincidence. Someone was following them, and given what had happened to Sarah's family, he had a good idea who it might be. Tom Bradley's gang never left loose ends, and a surviving witness represented exactly the kind of loose end that could get them all hanged. "We need to pick up the pace," Charles said, urging his horse into a faster trot. Sarah sensed the change in his posture, the way his body tensed like a coiled spring. She had learned to read the subtle signs of danger during their journey west, and she recognized them now in the set of Charles's shoulders. "They're following us, aren't they?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Charles nodded grimly, his hand moving instinctively to check his revolver. "How many?" she whispered. "3, maybe 4 riders. They've been staying just out of rifle range, but they're getting closer." Charles scanned the terrain ahead, looking for any advantage they might use. The land here was flat and open, offering little in the way of cover or concealment. Their only hope was to reach Fort Worth before the pursuing riders caught up to them. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of gunfire echoed across the prairie. Charles felt Sarah's arms tighten around him as bullets whined past their heads. "Hold on!" he shouted, spurring his horse into a full gallop. The chase had begun, and everything now depended on the speed of their mount and the accuracy of Charles's aim. Behind them, The dust cloud grew larger, and Charles knew that Tom Bradley's men were closing in for the kill. The race against death had begun, and only one side would see another sunrise. The abandoned mining camp appeared like a mirage in the shimmering heat, its weathered buildings offering the first real cover they had seen in hours. Charles pulled his exhausted horse behind the largest structure, a partially collapsed general store, and helped Sarah dismount. Her legs nearly buckled from the strain of clinging to the saddle during their desperate flight, but she forced herself to stay upright. Behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew steadily closer. "There's something you need to know," Sarah said suddenly, her voice urgent. Charles looked at her questioningly as he checked his ammunition. "The man with the scar, the one who killed my family. I heard him talking to his men. He wasn't just after our money." She paused, gathering courage for what she had to say next. "He was talking about a cavalry payroll, gold coins worth thousands of dollars. He said it was being transported through this territory next week." Charles felt his blood run cold. A cavalry payroll meant federal troops, and federal troops meant that Tom Bradley's gang was planning something much bigger than simple highway robbery. It also meant that Sarah was the only person who could identify the men responsible, making her more valuable dead than alive. "That's why they're following us," he realized aloud. "You're the only witness who can connect them to the murders." The sound of horses entering the camp cut their conversation short. Charles peered around the corner of the building and counted 4 riders, their faces hard and unforgiving beneath the brims of their hats. Tom Bradley himself led them, his distinctive scar clearly visible even at a distance. The outlaws' eyes swept the abandoned buildings methodically, searching for any sign of their quarry. "Split up," Bradley called to his men. "Check every building. They can't have gone far on that tired horse." The gang dispersed, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this kind of hunting before. Charles knew they had perhaps minutes before they were discovered, and his single revolver wouldn't be enough against 4 experienced killers. That's when he saw the other riders approaching from the east, 3 men in cavalry uniforms, their brass buttons glinting in the afternoon sun. Charles recognized the lead rider immediately, Captain William Hayes, a man he had served with during the war. Hayes had always been a good soldier and a better friend, and Charles had never been happier to see anyone in his life. "Captain Hayes!" Charles called out, stepping into view with his hands raised to show he meant no harm. The cavalry officer's weathered face broke into a surprised grin when he recognized his old comrade. "Charles Goodnight, as I live and breathe," Hayes said, dismounting quickly. "What brings you to this godforsaken place?" But before Charles could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted from the other side of the camp. Tom Bradley's men had spotted the cavalry patrol and were trying to shoot their way out. "Those men murdered this woman's family," Charles said quickly, drawing his revolver. "They're planning to rob a cavalry payroll next week." Hayes' expression hardened instantly, and he signaled to his men to take defensive positions. The battle was brief but fierce. Caught between Charles and the cavalry patrol, Bradley's gang found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. 2 of the outlaws fell in the first exchange of gunfire, and a third surrendered when he realized the hopelessness of their situation. But Tom Bradley himself managed to slip away in the confusion, disappearing into the maze of abandoned buildings like smoke in the wind. "He's gone," Hayes said grimly as they searched the camp. "But we'll get him eventually. Men like that always surface again." He turned to Sarah, his voice gentle despite the violence they had just witnessed. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, but your testimony will help us bring these men to justice." As the sun began to set, Charles realized that their ordeal was far from over. Tom Bradley was still out there somewhere, nursing his wounds and planning his revenge. And as long as Sarah remained alive to testify against him, she would never truly be safe. The small church in Cedar Creek stood silhouetted against the evening sky, its simple wooden cross casting a long shadow across the dusty main street. Captain Hayes had insisted they stop here for the night, knowing that Pastor William Hayes, his younger brother, would provide them sanctuary until they could arrange proper protection for Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. The two brothers, one wielding a sword and the other a Bible, had both chosen to fight evil in their own ways. Inside the modest sanctuary, Sarah sat in the front pew, her hands folded in prayer. The events of the past few days had shaken her faith, but not destroyed it. She had seen too much darkness to believe that God had abandoned the world entirely, but she struggled to understand why innocent people like James and Timothy had to suffer, while men like Tom Bradley continued to spread violence across the frontier. Charles stood near the altar, speaking quietly with Pastor Hayes about the best way to get Sarah safely to Fort Worth. But his eyes kept drifting to the woman in the pew, noting the way candlelight played across her features and how she seemed to find peace in this simple place of worship. He had never been a particularly religious man, but something about Sarah's quiet strength made him want to believe in something greater than himself. "She's been through hell," Pastor Hayes observed, following Charles's gaze. "But there's still light in her eyes. That's the mark of a soul that refuses to be broken." The pastor paused, studying Charles with the penetrating look that came from years of counseling troubled souls. "And what about you, Mr. Goodnight? What brings a man like you to risk everything for a stranger?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions he couldn't quite name. "Maybe I'm tired of riding alone," he said finally. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing good people suffer while I just keep moving on to the next town, the next job. Maybe it's time I stopped running from the past and started building something for the future." Sarah approached them, having finished her prayers. In the candlelight, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also more determined than Charles had seen her since the attack. "Pastor Hayes, would it be possible for you to perform a marriage ceremony tonight?" she asked quietly. Both men stared at her in surprise, but she continued before either could speak. "I know it sounds sudden, but I've been thinking about what Captain Hayes said. As long as I'm Sarah Mitchell, I'm a witness who needs to be silenced. But as Sarah Goodnight, I become something else entirely." Charles felt his heart skip a beat. "Sarah, you don't have to do this for protection. I'll keep you safe regardless." "This isn't just about protection," she said, turning to face him fully. "Charles, you saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me a reason to keep going when I wanted to give up. You showed me kindness when the world showed me only cruelty. I may have lost my first family, but maybe God is giving me a chance at a second one." The pastor looked between them, seeing something that went deeper than mere convenience. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," he said gently, "not to be entered into lightly or for practical reasons alone." "Then let me ask you a question," Sarah said, her voice steady. "When you look at us together, do you see two people using each other? Or do you see two souls who have found something worth fighting for?" She took Charles's hands in hers, her touch sending warmth up his arms. "Charles Goodnight, will you have me as your wife? Not out of duty or protection, but because you believe we could build something beautiful together from the ashes of what we've lost." Charles looked into her eyes and saw his answer reflected there. Sometimes the most important decisions in life came not from careful planning, but from the heart's recognition of truth. "Yes," he said simply, "I will." As the church bells chimed the hour, two broken souls prepared to become whole again through the simple power of love and faith. The wedding ceremony was simple but profound, conducted by candlelight in the small church as the Texas wind whispered through the wooden walls. Pastor Hayes spoke the ancient words that had bound countless couples together, while Captain Hayes and his men stood guard outside, their rifles ready for any sign of Tom Bradley's return. Sarah wore her traveling dress, cleaned as best as possible, while Charles had polished his boots and combed his hair back with water from the church well. They had no rings to exchange, so Charles offered Sarah his father's pocket watch, and she gave him her mother's small silver cross. "With this watch, I give you my time," Charles said, his voice rough with emotion. "All my days, all my years, from this moment forward. With this cross, I give you my faith," Sarah replied, her eyes shining with tears that were no longer born of grief, but of hope. "In God, in love, and in the future we'll build together." When Pastor Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Charles kissed Sarah gently, tasting salt tears on her lips, but knowing they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. In that moment, surrounded by the sacred quiet of the church, both felt something they hadn't experienced in years, the sense that they truly belonged somewhere, with someone. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of gunfire from outside. Tom Bradley had returned, and he had brought reinforcements. Charles heard Captain Hayes shouting orders to his men, the sharp crack of rifles, and the thundering of hooves as horses charged toward the church. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the back of the sanctuary, where a small door led to the pastor's quarters. "The bell tower," Pastor Hayes said urgently, pointing to a narrow ladder that led upward. "There's a window that faces the creek. You can climb down and escape while we hold them off." Charles nodded grimly, knowing that the pastor and the soldiers were buying their freedom with their lives. The climb up the bell tower seemed endless, each rung bringing them closer to safety, but also closer to the sound of battle below. When they reached the top, Charles could see the full scope of the fight. Bradley had brought at least 8 men, and they had the church surrounded. But Captain Hayes and his soldiers were giving as good as they got, using the building's thick walls for protection, while picking off the outlaws one by one. Charles helped Sarah through the small window, then followed her onto the narrow ledge that ran around the outside of the bell tower. The drop to the creek below looked impossibly far, but it was their only chance. "Trust me," he whispered, taking her hand. "We jumped together on 3. 1, 2. They leapt into the darkness, falling through the cool night air toward the rushing water below. The creek was deeper than Charles had hoped, and the current was strong, but they managed to stay together as the water carried them away from the church and the sound of gunfire. When they finally dragged themselves onto the far bank, soaked and exhausted, the battle was still raging behind them. "We have to keep moving," Charles said, helping Sarah to her feet. "Bradley won't give up easily." But as they walked away into the night, hand in hand, Charles realized that Tom Bradley no longer mattered. The outlaw could chase them across every mile of Texas if he wanted, but he could never take away what they had found together. They were no longer 2 broken souls wandering alone through the wilderness. They were Charles and Sarah Goodnight, husband and wife, and together they could face whatever the frontier threw at them. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, they walked toward their new life together, leaving the shadows of the past behind them forever.